All right, we're on to the second analogy. I'm too tired to read. I feel like I should go to bed, but I'm gonna push through. It's kind of fucking crazy. How much work I've put into this. I've obviously read, the first 150 pages multiple times now, maybe 3 or 4 times, honestly. And after all this work, I am at page 212. And there's 456 pages to go, I think. I think it's 668. Wow, that's a lot of pages. Especially when I'm doing like 10 pages an hour. Okay, let's just, one word at a time. Here we go. Second analogy. The principle of succession in time according to the law of causality. All alterations take place according to the law of the connection of cause and effect. Proof. It has been shown by the preceding principle that all appearances of the succession in time are one and all only alterations, i.e., a successive being and not being of the determinations of substance, which itself is permanent. And consequently, it's a good summary of the first analogy, and consequently, that the being of the substance itself, which follows upon its not being, or its not being, which follows upon its being, is inadmissible. In other words, that there is no arising or perishing of substance itself. Okay, we talked about that, like something coming from outside of the timeline. It doesn't work. The same principle might also have been expressed thus. All change, succession of appearances is only alteration. For arising and perishing would not be alterations of the substance, because the concept of alteration presupposes the same substance. Sorry, I wanted to reread that. All change, succession of appearances is only alteration. For arising and perishing would not be alterations of the substance, because the concept of alteration presupposes the same subject as existing with two opposite determinations, right? And therefore being permanent. After this preliminary reminder, we shall proceed to the proof. That's actually really helpful. Thank you, Kant. I perceive that appearances succeed one another. Appearances succeed one another. That is, that there is a state of things at one time the opposite of which existed in a previous state. I am therefore really connecting two perceptions in time, right? Connection is not the work of the mere sense and of intuition, but is here the product of a synthetic power of the faculty of imagination, which determines inner sense with respect to relations of time. In other words, I think what he's saying is like, okay, I have a picture of an ice cube and then a picture of a puddle of water. That's not sufficient to show me like the succession of an object melting, of the ice cube melting. I need, the connection of those two things in the synthesis, and also I need to add time to it as well. Like, that is necessary. Just the succession of objects is insufficient to show kind of the relations of time and an alteration occurring. Imagination, however, can connect these two states in two ways, so that either the one or the other proceeds in time, for time cannot be perceived in itself, nor can what precedes or what follows in the object be determined empirically, as it were, with reference to time. I am therefore conscious only that my imagination places the one before, the other after, and not in the object, the one state comes before the other. In other words, the objective relation of appearances following upon one another, remains undetermined through mere perception. Okay, that makes sense. It would just be perceiving them isn't sufficient. We need, again, I think we need synthesis and I think we need time. Both of those things. Excuse me. In order that this objective relation may be known as determined, the relation between the two states must be thought in such a way that it determines as necessary which of the two should be placed before and which after, and not conversely. Such a concept involving the necessity of synthetic unity can only be a pure concept of the understanding, which is not contained in perception. Okay. Not sure about that one. In this case, it is the concept of the relation of cause and effect. Ooh, it's a big one. The former determining the latter in time as the consequence, not as something that might proceed only in imagination, or might not be perceived at all. I'm going to try to stand and read. Moving my standing desk. I might have to move my charger, my computer charger. Yeah, I have to. All right, well, this feels, I don't know, fancy. Fancy's not the right word. Okay. Experience itself, therefore, that is, an empirical knowledge of appearances, is possible only by our subjecting the succession of appearances, and with it all alteration, to the law of causality, and appearances themselves as objects of experience are consequently possible only in accordance with this law. The apprehension of the manifold of appearance is always successive. The representations of the parts follow one upon another. Whether they also follow one upon the other in the object is a second point for reflection, not already contained in the first. We may indeed call everything, even every representation, insofar as we are conscious of it, an object. Okay. But it requires a more profound investigation to discover what this word may mean with regard to appearances, not insofar as they, as representations, are objects, but insofar as they only signify an object. Insofar as appearances, taken only as representations, are at the same time objects of consciousness, they are not distinct from our apprehension, that is, from their being taken up into the synthesis of the imagination, and we must therefore say that the manifold of appearances is always produced in the mind successively. Sorry, why? I was there for the first part. Okay, insofar as appearances taken only as representations, okay, like how we're presented with reality, are at the same time objects of consciousness. Okay, so they, perceptions, appearances, representations are taken as objects in our consciousness. They are not distinct from our apprehension, okay? That is, they're being taken up into the synthesis of our imagination. And they must be taken in, successively. Okay. That makes sense. If appearances were things in themselves, the succession of the representations of their manifold would never enable us to judge how that manifold is combined in the object. We have always to deal only with our representations, how things may be in themselves, without reference to the representations by which they affect us. is completely beyond the sphere of our knowledge. Although, therefore, why is he talking about this right now? Okay, I'm going to sit down. That didn't last very long. I feel like a failure. Although, therefore, appearances are not things in themselves. And, okay, we got this, Kant. We did this like 100 pages, 150 pages ago. And although their representation in apprehension is always successive, I shall indicate that what kind of combination in time belongs to the manifold in appearances themselves. Thus, for instance, the apprehension of the manifold in the appearance of a house stands before me is successive. Okay, Professor Gijsbers talked about this. Like, effectively, he gives 3 examples. One is a dream, where he gets eaten by a dragon. Maybe he gets blown to smithereens by dragon fire breath. But either way, which doesn't really exist in reality. And doesn't really exist in time, therefore. I think is the point. But then there's, like, the perception of a house, where it's like, okay, I'm perceiving a house right now. Alright, there's the window. Oh, I see a door over there. These floors look nice, etc. And then there's I think the example Kant uses is a boat, but I think Professor Gijsbers talked about an apple falling out of a tree, and like you perceive an apple falling out of a tree. There's an apple in a tree. The apple is falling. The apple hits the ground. And the idea is, for the perception of the house, you perceived the different parts of the house in succession, but you didn't have to perceive them in succession in that way. You could have, for example, done door, window, floor, floor, window, door, etc., etc. You only happen to perceive them in succession that distinct way, by chance or choice, like whatever, it doesn't matter. But in order for the apple falling out of the tree to exist in time, it has to first be in the tree. It then has to fall, and it then has to hit the ground. Like, there's a necessity to the order in which it happens in time. And Kant's going to make use of this point. So I just wanted to talk about it briefly, make sure I kind of could explain it and understood it. Anyway. Okay, thus, for instance, the apprehension of the manifold in the appearance of a house that stands before me is successive. The question then arises whether the manifold of the house itself be successive by itself, which of course no one would admit. Whenever I raise my concepts of an object to their transcendental meaning, I find that a house is not a thing in itself, but only an appearance. Okay? That is, a representation, the transcendental object of which is unknown. What then can be the meaning of the question? How may the manifold be combined in the appearances itself, which is nothing in itself? That is a good question, Kant. Here, that which is contained in the successive apprehension is considered as representation, and the given appearance, though it is nothing but the sum total of these representations, is considered as their object, with which... Sorry, I lost it. Just thinking about work. Okay, here, that which is contained in the successive apprehension is considered a representation. Yes. And the given appearance, though it is nothing but the sum total of these representations, is considered as their object, with which my concept, drawn from the representations of apprehension, is to agree. As the agreement between knowledge and its object is truth, it is easily seen that we can here only be asking about the formal conditions of empirical truth, and that appearance, in contrast to the representations of apprehension, can be represented as an object distinct from them only if it is subject to the rule that distinguishes it from every other apprehension, and makes necessary a certain kind of combination of the manifold. is a really confusing way to describe the house metaphor, but I think I'm there. That which in the appearance contains the condition of this necessary rule of apprehension is the object. Let us now proceed to our task. Great fucking idea, Kant. One of your best. Good job. Sorry. That something takes place, that is, that something or some state which did not exist before begins to exist, cannot be perceived empirically unless it is preceded by an appearance which does not contain that state. Okay, I agree. For a reality following upon an empty time, that is, an arising, not preceded by any state of things, can be apprehended as little as empty time itself. Sorry, what? For a reality following upon an empty time, that is, an arising not preceded by any state of things, can be apprehended as little as empty time itself. Okay, it's a totally normal sentence to say. Every apprehension of an event is therefore a perception following another perception. But since this applies to all synthesis of apprehension, as I showed before in the appearance of a house, this apprehension is thereby not yet distinguished from any other. But I observe at the same time that if in an appearance which contains an event I call the antecedent state of perception A and the subsequent B, then B can only follow A in my apprehension, while the perception of A can never follow B, but can only precede it. Okay. I see, for instance, a boat. Now he's talking about the necessity. A boat gliding down the river. My perception of its position downstream follows my perception of its position upstream in the course of the river, and it is impossible in the apprehension of this appearance that the ship should be perceived first downstream and then upstream. We see, therefore, that the order in the succession of perceptions in our apprehension is here determinate, and the apprehension is tied to that order. Yes, I understand. In the former example of a house, my perceptions could, in apprehension, begin at the roof and end at the basement, or begin below and end above. They could apprehend the manifold of the empirical intuition from right to left, or from left to right. There was therefore no determinate order in the sequence of these perceptions, necessitating the point where I had to begin in apprehension in order to combine the manifold empirically. While in the perception of an event there is always this rule, and it makes the order of the successive perceptions in the apprehension of this appearance necessary. Okay. I had a really big cheeseburger for dinner, and it was pretty salty. So I'm trying to drink a lot of water. And I want to drink a lot of water because it was salty. Okay. Moving along. So, I'm getting stuff. We're figuring stuff out. Feels good. Another page closer. In our case, therefore, we shall have to derive the subjective succession of apprehension from the objective succession of the appearances. Right, the subjective succession of apprehension, meaning like what I choose to, well, maybe not choose, but like what I do perceive in appearances, meaning the house from left to right, right to left, basement to ceiling. That's the subjective succession, whereas the objective succession is the boat going upstream. It has to go from one end to the other. Because otherwise the former, subjective succession, would be entirely indeterminate and unable to distinguish one appearance from another. The former by itself proves nothing as to the connection of the manifold in the object, because it is altogether arbitrary. Right? The latter must therefore consist in the order of the manifold of appearance, according to which the apprehension of one, what happens, follows upon the apprehension of the other, what proceeds, in conformity with a rule. Yes. Thus, only can I be justified in... Thus only can I be justified in saying not merely of my apprehension, but of the appearances itself, that there exists in it a succession, which is the same as to say that I cannot arrange the apprehension otherwise than in this very succession. Okay. In conformity with such a rule, there must exist, in that which precedes an event, the condition of a rule by which this event invariably and necessarily follows. But I cannot go back from the event and determine through apprehension that which precedes. For no appearance goes back from the succeeding to the preceding point in time, though it does refer to some preceding point in time, while the progress from a given time to the determinate following time is necessary. Therefore, as there certainly is something that follows, I must necessarily refer it to something else in general which precedes it, and upon which it follows, according to a rule, that is by necessity. Okay, I must necessarily refer it to something else in general which precedes it, and upon which it follows according to a rule, that is by necessity. Thus the event as the condition affords a sure indication of some condition, while this condition itself determines the event. Okay? Let us suppose that an event is not preceded by anything upon which such an event must follow according to a rule. All succession of perception would then be determined solely in apprehension, that is, merely subjectively. Let us suppose that an event is not preceded by anything upon which such an event must follow according to a rule. Right, all succession would be arbitrary, okay. All succession of perception would then be determined solely in apprehension, that is, merely subjectively. But it would not thereby be determined objectively which of the perceptions should actually precede and which should follow. We would thus have a mere play of representations which would not refer to any object, that is, no appearance would by our perception be distinguished in a temporal relation from all other appearances. That makes sense. Meaning, like, if the apple didn't have to be in the tree, fall from the tree, hit the ground, and it was just like whatever we looked at was what happened first, and then the second thing we looked at happened next, there wouldn't necessarily be a connection between the objects and the causes and the effects and everything. Like, everything would just be kind of arbitrary, it would seem. He hasn't said it that distinctly, but that's kind of what I feel like he's getting at. For the succession and apprehension would always be the same, and there would be nothing in the appearance to determine the succession so as to render a certain sequence objectively necessary. Yes. Yes, Kant. Okay. I cannot say, therefore, that two states follow upon each other in appearance, but only that one apprehension follows another. And this is merely something subjective and does not determine any object, and hence cannot be considered as knowledge of an object, even of an object in appearance. Okay? If therefore we experience that something happens, then we always presuppose that something precedes it, on which it follows according to a rule. Okay, hold on. If therefore we experience that something happens, then we always presuppose that something precedes it, on which it follows according to a rule. Yes. Otherwise, I could not say of the object that it follows, because the mere succession in my apprehension without being determined by a rule with regard to something that precedes would not justify a succession in the object. It is therefore always with respect to a rule that I render my subjective synthesis of apprehension objective, a rule, namely in accordance with which appearances in their succession, that is, okay, I gotta restart this, it's important. I mean, all of this is important. Every word. It is therefore always with respect to a rule that I render my subjective synthesis of apprehension objective. A rule, namely, in accordance with which appearances in their succession, that is, as they happen, are determined by the preceding state. And it is only under this presupposition that the experience of something that happens is possible. Okay. So, in other words, I'm putting a rule upon objects. Objects have to essentially, I do have some subjective choice in that our subjective, what does he call it? Perception. But, like, there is some subjective component in like, what I, like, distinctly perceive at any given time. But, like, the objects in reality also, they have to effectively, sorry, I say effectively too much. They have to be presented and conform to rules related to them being in time successively, which means that it's not subjective, it's not arbitrary, it's them existing in time for us to perceive. Okay. It might seem, indeed, as if this were a contradiction to all that has always been said about the course taken by human understanding. It was supposed that only by perceiving and comparing many events following in the same manner on preceding appearances, we are first led to the discovery of a rule according to which certain events always follow on certain appearances, and that only thus we are enabled to form the concept of a cause. This was Hume's issue, but if this were so, this concept would be merely empirical, and the rule which it supplies, that everything which happens has a cause, would be as contingent as the experience itself. The universality and necessity of that rule would then only be fictitious and devoid of any true and universal validity. Yes, that makes sense. Because they would not be a priori, but founded only on induction. The case with this is the same as with other pure a priori representations, for instance space and time, which we are able to extract as pure concepts from experience only because we have put them into experience, and so we have first brought experience about through them. It is true, no doubt, that the logical clarity of this representation of a rule determining the succession of events as a concept of cause becomes possible only when we have used it in experience. But a recognition of this representation as the condition of the synthetic unity of appearances in time was nevertheless the foundation of the experience itself, and consequently preceded it a priori. The recognition of this representation as the condition of synthetic unity of appearances in time, what we just talked about, things like preceding each other in an order, I think, was nevertheless the foundation of the experience itself, and consequently preceded it a priori. It is necessary, therefore, to show in the example that we never, even in experience, ascribe the succession of an event, something happens that did not exist before, to the object, and distinguish it from the subjective succession of our apprehension, except when there is at the foundation a rule which compels us to observe this order of perceptions. Right, like gravity. Gravity's not a good example. Like the apple. Nay, it is necessary to show that it is the compulsion which first renders the representation of a succession in the object possible. Okay, I'm losing steam. How many pages to finish this? I think I got 9 pages left. Okay, less than that. 8 pages. Okay, I can do this. Got spike up. Christopher Maltasante. We have representations within us and can become conscious of them. But however far that consciousness may extend, and however accurate and exact it may be, yet the representations are always only representations, that is, inner determinations of our mind in this or that relation of time. What right have we, then, to add to these representations an object, or to ascribe to these modifications, beyond their subjective reality, another objective reality of some kind? Their objective meaning cannot consist in their reference to another representation of that which one would wish to call the object, for otherwise the question again arises how this latter representation goes beyond itself and receives an objective meaning in addition to the subjective one which belongs to it as a determination of the mental state. If we try to find out what new quality and dignity is imparted to our representations by the reference to an object, we find that this reference does nothing but render necessary the combination of representations in a certain way, and their being subjected to a rule, and we find on the contrary that they receive their objective character only because a certain order in the temporal relation of our representation is necessary. Okay? In the synthesis of appearances, the manifold of our representations is always successive. Yes? No object is thus represented, because through this succession, which is common to all apprehensions, nothing is distinguished from anything else. As a point of successions, like everything is within the succession, so nothing in that sense is distinct. Okay. But as soon as I perceive or anticipate that there is in the succession a reference to the preceding state upon which the representation follows by rule, then something presents itself as an event or as something that happens. That is to say, I know an object to which I must assign a certain position in time. Right. The apple. Like, if a house is just sitting there presenting itself to you, it doesn't force you to think about it being presented to you successively. I guess if you really got down to it, we're like, okay, you know, this frame of the house, now this frame of the house, now this frame of the house, like if you think about it like a movie reel. But if you're presented with the coconut, is it coconut tree? No, it's an apple tree. Then you have to be like, oh yeah, it had to be in the tree, then I had to see it fall down, then it had to hit the ground, then it had to roll over to me. Because you're presented with some sort of like dynamic thing in time. At least more dynamic than a stationary house just sitting there. Okay, which after the preceding state cannot be given to it differently. When, therefore, I perceive that something happens, this representation contains that something precedes, because by reference to what precedes, the appearance receives its relation of time, that is, to exist after a time in which it did not exist. Right. In order for something to, like, happen, like, there presupposes a pre-happening state. And both of those are, like, I don't know, in relation, relatable in terms of time. Its determinate position in time within this relation can only be assigned to it if the antecedent state is if in the antecedent state something is presupposed on which it follows always. That is, follows according to a rule. It thus follows, first of all, that I cannot reverse the series. True. And place that which happens before that upon which it follows. Secondly, that if the preceding state is posited, the other event follows inevitably and necessarily. Thus it happens that there arises an order among our representations, in which the present state, as having not come to be, points to a preceding state as a correlate of the event that is given, a correlate which, although as yet indeterminate, refers in a determining way to this event as its consequence, and connects the event with itself necessarily in the series of time. Okay? If, then, it is a necessary law of our sensibility, and therefore a formal condition of all perceptions, that a preceding time necessarily determines the succeeding time, because I cannot arrive at the succeeding time except through the preceding one, then it is also an indispensable law of the empirical representation of the series of time that the appearances of past time determine every existence in succeeding time. Yeah, okay. And that these existences as events cannot take place except insofar as the appearances of past time determine their existence in time, that is, fix it by a rule. For it is only in appearances that we can know empirically this continuity in the coherence of times. What is required for all experience and for its possibility is understanding. And the first thing that is contributed by it is not that it renders the representation of objects distinct, but that it renders the representation of an object possible at all. This takes place by the understanding transferring the order of time to the appearances and their existence, and by assigning to each of them as consequence. It's effectively like the rule of succession. This takes place by the understanding transferring the order of time to the appearances and their existence. And by assigning to each of them, as consequence, a position in time determined a priori with respect to preceding appearances. Without this position, appearances would not be in agreement with time itself, which determines a priori the position for all its parts. Okay. This determination of position cannot be derived from the relation in which appearances stand to absolute time, for absolute time cannot be an object of perception. But on the contrary, appearances must themselves determine for one another their positions in time, and render them necessary in the order of time. Okay? In other words, what happens or follows must follow according to a general rule upon that which was contained in the previous state. We thus get a series of appearances, which by means of the understanding produces and makes necessary in the series of possible perceptions the same order and continuous coherence which exists a priori in the form of inner intuition, that is, time, in which all perceptions must have their position. Sorry, I gotta read that again. We thus get a series of appearances, okay, by means of the understanding, right, produces and makes necessary in the series of possible perceptions the same order and continuous coherence which exists a priori in the form of inner intuition, that is, time, in which all perceptions must have their position. That makes sense. Sounds a lot like reality. Okay. That something happens is therefore a perception which belongs to a possible experience, and this experience becomes actual when I consider the appearance as determined with regard to its position in time, that is to say, as an object which can always be found according to a rule in the coherence of perceptions. This rule, by which we determine everything according to the succession of time, is that the condition under which an event follows at all times, that is necessarily, is to be found in what precedes. All possible experience, therefore, that is, all objective knowledge of appearances with regard to their relation in the sequence of time, is founded on the principle of sufficient reason. Okay. I don't know. This all kind of makes sense. It feels like he's saying. It feels like I'm missing something because it makes too much sense. Like there's another level that he's at that I'm not getting. The ground of proof of this principle rests entirely on the following considerations. All empirical knowledge requires the synthesis of the manifold through the imagination, which synthesis is always successive. That is, the representations always follow one another. In the imagination, however, this sequence is not at all determined with regard to the order, that is, as to what precedes and what must follow, and the series of successive representations may be taken as going backward just as well as forwards. If this synthesis, however, is a synthesis of apprehension, I think that would be like the dream thing, the last sentence, like the dragon dream, it doesn't, it feels like it's going probably according to time, but it isn't really, because it exists kind of outside of time, and it could go, it doesn't have to like obey the traditional laws of time, right? Like the boat could go forward and backward or whatever, like, I don't know. But then he's going to talk about actual apprehension, I think. If this synthesis, however, is a synthesis of apprehension of the manifold of a given appearance, then the order is determined in the object. Or to speak more accurately, there is then the apprehension, in the apprehension, an order of successive synthesis which determines an object. And according to this order, something must necessarily precede, and when it is posited, then the other event must necessarily follow. Right. If, therefore, my perception is to contain the knowledge of an event, or of something as actually happening, then it must be an empirical judgment in which we think the sequence is determined. That is, it presupposes another appearance in time, upon which it follows necessarily, or according to a rule. If it were different, if I posited the antecedent and the event did not follow upon it necessarily, it would become to me a mere subjective play of my fancies. Arbitrary, subjective. And if I still represented it to myself as something objective, I should call it a mere dream. Therefore, the relation of appearances as possible perceptions therefore the relation of appearances as possible perceptions, according to which the existence of what follows happens, is determined in time, necessarily and by a rule, by something preceding it. In other words, a relation of cause and effect. The cause and effect forms the condition of the objective validity of our empirical judgments with regard to the series of perceptions. So effectively, like, objects as they exist in time are always given to us in succession, and it is like the way that we synthesize them and experience actual apprehensions of things is in this succession, and therefore that is what cause and effect is. Like the series of things happening, appearances going before us and proceeding in a succession through time and being synthesized in the unity of the manifold. I think. I'm excited because I feel like I kind of get it for the first time. Maybe not for the first time, but like fairly quickly without that much agonizing. The principle of the causal relation in the succession of appearances is valid, therefore, also for all objects of experience under the conditions of succession, because that principle is itself the ground of the possibility of such experience. Here, however, we meet with a difficulty that must first be removed. The principle of the causal connection among appearances is restricted in our formula to their succession. The principle of the causal connection among appearances is restricted in our formula to their succession, while in practice we find that it applies also to their coexistence, right? Because cause and effect may exist simultaneously. There may be, for instance, heat inside a room which is not found in the open air. If I look for its cause, I find a heated stove, but this stove, as cause, is simultaneously with its effect, the heat of the room, and there is therefore no sequence in time between cause and effect. They are simultaneous, and yet the law applies. The fact is that the greater part of the efficient causes in nature are simultaneous with their effects, and the succession of these effects in time is due only to this, that a cause cannot produce its whole effect in one instant. But at the instant in which the effect arises, it is always simultaneous with the causality of its cause. For if this cause had ceased one instant before, the effect would never have arisen. Here we must note that what we have to reckon with is the order, not the lapse of time, and that the relation remains even if no time has elapsed. The time between the causality of the cause and the immediate effect can be vanishingly brief. They may be simultaneous, but the relation of the one to the other always remains determinable in time. If I regard as a cause a ball that rests on a soft cushion and impresses a hollow in it, the cause is simultaneous with its effect, but I nevertheless distinguish the two through the temporal relation of their dynamical connection. For if I place the ball on the cushion, its previous smooth surface is followed by a hollow. But if there is, I know not whence, a hollow in the cushion, a leaden ball does by no means follow upon it. Succession in time is therefore the only empirical criterion of an effect. Okay, this seems important. Hold on. The succession in time, therefore, is therefore the only empirical criterion of an effect with regard to the causality of the cause which precedes it. Okay, starting to fade again. The succession in time is therefore the only empirical criterion of an effect with regard to the causality of the cause which precedes it. The glass is the cause of the rising of the water above its horizontal surface, although both appearances are simultaneous. For as soon as I draw off water from the larger vessel into the glass, something follows, namely the alteration of the horizontal state, which the water had before, to a concave state, which it assumes in the glass. This causality leads to the concept of action, and this in turn to the concept of force, and thereby to the concept of substance. As I do not mean to burden my critical task, which only concerns the source of synthetic a priori knowledge, with analytical processes which aim merely at the explanation and not the expansion of our concepts, I leave a detailed treatment of these to a future system of pure reason. Indeed, I may refer to many well-known textbooks in which such an analysis may be found. I cannot, however, pass over the empirical criterion of a substance insofar as it seems to manifest itself not so much through the permanence of appearance, but more adequately and easily through action. Wherever there is action, and hence activity enforced, there must be substance. And in this substance alone, the seat of that fertile source of the appearance must be sought. This sounds very well, but if people are asked to explain what they mean by substance, they find it by no means easy to answer without reasoning in a circle. How can we immediately infer from the action the permanence of the agent, which nevertheless is an essential and peculiar characteristic of substance as phenomenon? After what we have explained before, however, the answer to this question is not so difficult, though it would be impossible according to the ordinary way of proceeding merely analytically with our concepts. Action itself implies the relation of the subject of the causality to the effect. As any effect consists in that which happens, that is, in the changeable that signifies time in terms of succession, the ultimate subject of the changeable is the permanent, as the substratum of all that changes, that is, substance. The ultimate subject of the changeable is the permanent, so substance. For according to the principle of causality, actions are always the first ground of all changes of appearances, and cannot exist, therefore, in a subject that itself changes, because in that case other actions and another subject would be required to determine that change. Right, things don't just change by themselves, kind of. Action, therefore, is a sufficient empirical criterion to prove substantiality of a subject, nor do I first of all need to establish its permanence by means of comparing perceptions. Besides, such proof by means of comparison would hardly be possible in the completeness that is required by the magnitude and strict universality of the concept. That the first subject of the causality of all arising and perishing cannot itself, in the field of appearances, arise and perish, is a safe inference. That the first subject of the causality of all rising and perishing cannot itself, in the field of appearances, arise and perish, is a safe inference, which in the end points to empirical necessity and permanence in existence, that is, to the concept of a substance as appearance. Okay, I'm not sure I'm following this. Okay. When something happens, the mere arising, without any regard to what arises, is in itself already a matter for inquiry. The transition from not being of a state to this state, even though it contained no quality whatever in appearance, must itself be investigated. This arising, as we have shown in the first analogy, does not concern substance, because substance does not arise, but its state. Arising is therefore a mere alteration. Okay, interesting. And not an origin out of nothing. If such an origin is looked upon as the effect of a foreign cause, it is called creation. This can never be admitted as an event among appearances, because its very possibility would destroy the unity of appearance. If, however, we consider all things not as phenomena, but as things in themselves, and as objects merely of the understanding, then despite their being substances, they can be considered as dependent with regard to their existence on a foreign cause. Right. Like, I don't know, like a person. You start with, an egg, and then there's a foreign thing that comes into it and makes a person. Okay, anyway. Maybe that's a bad example. Our words would then assume a quite different meaning and no longer be applicable to appearances as possible objects of experience. How anything can be altered at all. How anything can be altered at all, that is, how it is possible that upon one state at a given time an opposite state may follow at another time. Of this we do not know, we do not a priori have the slightest conception. Right, that's empirical. For this conception, we need a knowledge of actual forces, which can only be given empirically. For instance, a knowledge of motive forces, or, which is the same, knowledge of certain successive appearances as motions. Which indicate the presence of such forces. What can still be considered a priori, according to the law of causality and the conditions of time, are the form of every alteration. Go on. The condition under which alone, as an arising of another state, it can take place, its content, that is, the state which is altered, being what it may, and therefore the succession itself of the states, that which has happened. When a substance passes from one state into A into another B, the point in time after the latter is different from the point in time of the former state, and follows it. Again, that second state as a reality in the appearance differs from the first in which that reality did not exist, as B differs from 0. That is, even if the state B differed from the state A only in magnitude, the alteration of an arising BA, which in the previous state was non-existent, and in relation to which that state equals 0. Okay, so what? The question therefore arises how a thing can pass from a state equals A to another equals B. Between two instants there is always time, and between two states at these two instants there is always a difference which must have a certain magnitude, because all parts of appearance are always themselves magnitudes. Every transition, therefore, from one state to another takes place in a time between two instants, the first of which determines the state from which a thing leaves, the second that at which it arrives. Both instants, therefore, are the temporal limits of an alteration, and so limits of the intermediate state between two states, and belong as such to the whole alteration. Now every alteration has a cause which demonstrates its causality during the whole time in which the alteration takes place. The cause therefore does not produce the alteration suddenly, at once or in one instant, but during a time, so that as the time grows from the initial instant A to its completion B, the magnitude of the reality, BA, is also produced through all smaller degrees between the first degree and the last. All alteration is thus only possible through a continuous action of the causality, which, insofar as it is uniform, is called a moment. Alteration does not consist of such moments, but is produced by them as their effect. Okay, I mean, I don't know, yeah. it seems to make sense. This is the law. And probably what I'm missing is like why this is a priori synthetic. This is the law of continuity of all alteration. The ground of which is this, that neither time nor appearance in time consists of parts which are the smallest possible, and that nevertheless the state of a thing being altered passes through all these parts as elements to its second state. No difference of the real in the appearance and no difference in the magnitude of times is the smallest. And thus the new state of reality grows from the first state, in which this reality did not exist, through all the infinite degrees of this reality, the differences of which from one another are all smaller than that between 0 and A. It does not concern us at present of what utility this principle may be in the investigation of nature, but how such a principle, which seems to expand our knowledge of nature so much, can be possible completely a priori, requires a careful investigation. That's what I was wondering. Although we can see that it is real and true, and might thus imagine that the question of how the principle was possible is unnecessary. For so many claim with unfounded presumption to expand our knowledge by pure reason, that we must accept it as a general principle, to be distrustful throughout, and never to believe or assume anything of this kind, without documents capable of supplying a thorough deduction, however clear the dogmatic proof of it may appear. All addition to our empirical knowledge and every advance of perception, whatever the objects may be, whether appearances or pure intuitions, is nothing but an expansion of the determination of inner sense, that is, a progress in time. This progress in time determines everything, and is in itself determined by nothing else. That is, the parts of this progress are given only in time and through the synthesis of time, but not time before this synthesis. For this reason, every transition in our perception to something that follows in time is a determination of time through the production of this perception. I gotta reread that. For this reason, every transition in our perception to something that follows in time, right, is a determination of time through the production of this perception. Okay. And as time is always and in all its parts a magnitude, such transition is the production of a perception as a magnitude, through all degrees, none of them being the smallest, from 0 up to its determinate degree. In other words, even if we have an idea that transitions to another idea, that happens through time, and kind of, with recognition of time. I don't know. It makes sense. This shows how it is possible to know a priori a law of alterations, as far as their form is concerned. This is starting to get a little empirical, though. Because if we know that based on the fact that, well, I guess we can know that a priori without actually experiencing what he's talking about. Okay, so, yeah, okay. For we only anticipate our own apprehension, the formal condition of which, as it dwells in us before all given appearance, must certainly be capable of being known a priori. Alright, last paragraph. In the same manner, therefore, in which time contains the sensible a priori condition of the possibility of a continuous progress of that which exists to that which follows, the understanding, by means of the unity of apperception, is the a priori condition of the possibility of a continuous determination through the series of causes and effects of the position of all appearances in this time, the causes producing inevitably the existence of the effects, and thus rendering the empirical knowledge of the relations of time valid for every time, universally, and therefore objectively valid. Whew. Alright, I did not think when I sat down there's any chance in hell I was reading all this tonight. I normally do like 10 to 12 pages. This was 15 pages, 212 to 227, and I was pretty tired. But that was, I think that makes a lot of sense. But I'm concerned that it makes sense to me empirically, and I'm not understanding the a priori aspect of it. But that's whatever. We'll figure it out.